Okay, well, and I'm delighted to introduce Diederik Boertien as this week's Grad speaker. I saw him present, not once, but twice at PAA, and I thought this is someone doing interesting work, who's a good presenter, who I would like to spend time with. And that's exactly what happened. PAA, Okay, all right, so Diederik received his PhD in political and social sciences from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Did I do that? Any justice to that? Ah, God. And prior degrees from Edinburgh. There, I do that. Oh, and I cannot do
So aan de Vrije Universiteit.
Thank you. Amsterdam. He was a Max Weber Fellow and a postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence before assuming his current position as a researcher at the Center for Demographic Studies in Barcelona. His work focuses on family dynamics and inequality and has appeared in Demography, Journal of Marriage and the Family, and the European Sociological Review, among other outlets. Please join me in welcoming Diederik.
All right, thank you all for coming to my presentation. I'm very happy we have so many people here. I've had a great day so far, meeting Sarah, meeting Dennis, seeing Malmé again, and I'm meeting more people during the rest of the day, so thanks so much for coming here. Thanks Daniel Snyder for inviting me. As a European scholar working or sometimes working on the United States, it's a great opportunity to be able to present some of my work on the United States to this audience. So this is going to be the highlight of my day. So thank you all for being here. So I'm going to present some of my work that I'm writing together with Fabrizio Bernardi from the European University Institute in Florence. And this paper is about family structure in the United States. So given the topic, I thought it was a nice idea to start with a quotation. So, with a quotation from an American poet about family structure. So, Jill Scott Heron is an American poet and singer, and a couple of years before he passed away, he wrote an album where he kind of reflects about his life. And in the first poem or song, he reflects on his childhood, and it's actually called "Oncoming from a Broken Home." And he actually talks about how he grew up with his grandmother during his childhood. And at some point, he says something that as every ologist would certainly note, I had no strong male figure, right? So as an ologist, I'm a sociologist, maybe economists and demographers feel less addressed by this quote, but as an ologist, I thought this was interesting. Not only because of the theologist part, but also because I think this illustrates how widely spread the notion is that with whom we grow up and with whom we live with during childhood matters for our outcomes in life. And it is therefore not surprising that the following graph, that many of you will probably have seen, was met with a lot of concern. Namely, this is a graph showing increases in single motherhood across time. And not only has single motherhood been increasing, it has been increasing especially among lower educated mothers. And more generally, we see this socioeconomic stratification of family structure unfolding not only in the United States, but also in other Western contexts. So if we put these two pieces of information together, so that family structure matters for our outcomes in life, and that children from disadvantaged families are more likely to grow up in what I now label an alternative family structure that is normally often related to some disadvantages, this might, family structure might turn into a factor that has increased or polarized opportunities between social and economic groups. And this is, as you will all know, or many of you will know, one of the key ingredients of Sarah McLanahan's Diverging Destinies argument. So it's not only about family structure, of course, her argument, it's also about employment and about delays in childbearing and so forth. And she is arguing that many of the developments related to the second demographic transition are polarizing opportunities between children coming from different socioeconomic groups. So the part about family structure has actually been picked up by a lot of prominent scholars. So there are quite some scholars out there that have argued that family structure is a key factor that should be considered when we study inequality of opportunity. So it might have been a major driver of increases in inequality of opportunity. Book by Putnam, Cherlin, and of course this argument was not only introduced by Sarah McLennan, we can also go back to William Julius Wilson's book. So this argument about family structure being an important factor to be considered in studies of inequality of opportunity, I would say, is quite prominent. It is therefore quite surprising to find that there are very few quantifications of how much changes in family structure actually contributed to socioeconomic gaps in outcomes. And this is the main thing or the main objective of the study that I am presenting today. How much does the changes in family structure contribute? I think the question of how much is increasingly important for us as social scientists, since the amount of factors that matter for inequality of opportunity are basically endless. We should not only show that things matter, but we should also show how much they matter, so we can focus on the most influential outcomes. So I would like to dive a little bit more into detail into this argument that family structure matters for inequality of opportunity. Many of you might be familiar with this kind of schematic representation, where we see that, or where we argue that origins can be many characteristics. Here in this presentation I focus on socioeconomic background, is related to our outcomes in life. Basically, the question that we're interested in today is a very basic one of mediation. So there can be many factors that are responsible for creating a relationship between these two factors. We can think of schools, neighborhoods, but also many family characteristics such as income, educational resources, but also family structure. So basically we're trying to answer a very simple question. To what extent does childhood family structure mediate the relationship between origin and outcomes? And to what extent has this changed over time? So when we talk about mediation, in its very most basic form, at least two conditions have to be met. First of all, origin should be related to childhood family structure. This is what I've shown before, that we see that there is a stratification, a socioeconomic stratification in childhood family structure. And as I said, this has been shown for many countries, many different studies, many different measures. So we can kind of argue that this condition is in place. The second condition is that childhood family structure should be related to outcomes in life. Of course, there's a huge social science literature on this question, and there are a lot of a huge variety in results. And at least on the associational level, it seems that children growing up with two parents fare at least slightly better than those who do not. For instance, to illustrate, here are some numbers from some earlier study of for 4 countries where we see differences in the attainment of a college degree according to childhood family structure, very roughly categorized into those who live with both their parents and those who did not. And we see that especially in the United States, there is a big difference between both groups. But this is not the case in all countries. For instance, in Italy, differences are very, very small. So we might ask, what are the reasons? Of course, the question of cross-national differences is one I'm not going to go into, but this is a very interesting one. But why do we see differences between children who have spent their childhood with two parents and children who did not? Some people argue this is a question of economic resources. Others argue this has to do with parenting. Parenting styles, but also with time. There are many different possible mechanisms out there. But there are also people that have focused on causality. Especially given that selection into family structure is now so much related to socioeconomic disadvantage. Many people have argued, no, this correlation that we observe between family structure and outcomes is spurious. This is both the selection into family structure and the outcomes are driven by the third factors. Actually, Daniel Snyder wrote a review about research that looked at this question, and there are many studies that try to account for sources of endogeneity, so to get at this question of causality, and results are pretty mixed, and it seems to depend a bit on the outcome looked at. So, for instance, for cognitive ability, often once we account for endogeneity, the association disappears. For other outcomes, such as psychological well-being, high school completion, we see that associations remain at least to some extent. So, if we trust in the conclusions of those studies, we can kind of argue that the two basic conditions for mediation are in place, at least for some outcomes, at least for instance, high school completion and for psychological outcomes. So, on the most basic level, the conditions seem to be in place. However, the point I'm going to make now is one that is central to the rest of the presentation. If we complicate this a little bit more, and if we take into account the following arrow, that the effects of childhood family structure might not be the same for everybody, this whole picture can change. So, what is this argument that I'm making? There has actually been quite a lot of attention for this question over the last couple of years, that childhood family structure might not be equally important for children coming from different groups. There are two main hypotheses why this might be the case. First of all, it could be that resourceful families might be able to deal better with diversity. So this is what we see in most cases, right? There is, in general, there is like a crisis or something happens. Of course, a resourceful family normally is better able to deal with this. They have money, they can buy things, they have connections, and so forth. So this is maybe the intuitive hypothesis to think. However, we could also
by
look at,
resourceful, you just mean have a lot of resources?
yeah, like educational resources, but also income, like more in generally advantaged, socioeconomically advantaged families. So they have more resources. Yeah, exactly. However, we can also look at this in another way. Children from resourceful families might have more to lose. And actually, a lot of research, the findings are mixed, and it seems again to depend on the outcome we look at, but also the country that we study. But actually, most of the studies, or a lot of studies, find support for the second hypothesis. And how I see this is that if, for instance, we think that socioeconomic advantage is transmitted, for instance, through, if we look at Annette Laroe's work on parenting strategies, if intensive parenting, where we have continuous monitoring of the children, a lot of talking to the children, a lot of time-intensive activities, if we think this is, for instance, a key way through which advantage is transmitted across generations, family structure, so being a single parent, for instance, might pose serious obstacles towards such kind of parenting strategies. So if you are a child from a socioeconomically advantaged background, you might have much more to lose, for instance, from a parental separation than children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And these arguments can be applied not only to parenting styles, but also if, for instance, we talk about saving up for college. If advantaged children primarily rely on their parents paying for college, and if, for instance, a separation leads to a lot of wealth depletion, they might be affected much more by such events than children from disadvantaged families who might not have access to such economic resources to begin with. So this is an argument that I've actually been finding a lot myself, and actually last week
Can I just try to understand what...
Yeah.
There's two interpretations of this. One is that there are more resources that can be lost. The other is that the outcome is going to be more influenced. And so on the more resources, it seems kind of tautological. If you have more resources, then you have more to lose. But on the outcome, it seems like it might be the opposite. That if you're from a disadvantaged family, the kind of negative outcome is really, really bad. Whereas if you're from an advantaged family, the negative outcome is, maybe not so bad. Even though it's so which sense are you talking about it? Am I misinterpreting what you're saying?
So, if I understand your argument correctly, it could be that, for instance, if you're from a disadvantaged background and there is a separation, the risk of, for instance, entering into poverty is very high, which is much more serious than dropping from an advantage to a lower level. So I'm actually arguing that for many of the outcomes, it depends. So this is why it depends on the outcome. So in this paper, I'm looking at education. If we are talking maybe about psychological well-being, this might be the more relevant argument. If we're talking about, for instance, entrance into college, which depends a lot on having a lot of money, then probably this is more relevant. This drop from being, so to say, resourceful to having not enough money anymore to go into college is much more relevant for the advantaged.
But if we were talking about, say, not finishing high school, then we might have a different interpretation?
That is true. So this is actually something that some people are arguing, that this depends a little bit. If you're looking at, so to say, very commonly achieved outcomes, then this argument might not work. And it might especially work for kind of achievements that are not achieved by everybody. So yeah, this is a very good point. So I would kind of say that this is an argument that doesn't work so well maybe for the bottom. But later we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you.
No, thanks. Yeah, please interrupt me. I have no problem at all with interruptions. I did my PhD next to the economics department. Very useful. Actually, last week there is a paper came out in PNAS on this topic, and they actually show kind of the same thing. And they use like propensity scores and blah, blah, blah. And depending on the propensity of experiencing a parental separation, the effects appear to differ systematically. And they actually found the less likely, based on your characteristics, you are to experience a parental separation, the larger the effects. So, but I would like to emphasize that this is not a uniform finding. So it depends really a lot on the outcome and on the country. Educational attainment, we often see this pattern. So if this is true, we end up with a puzzle, right? So if, on the one hand, children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to grow up in an alternative family structure, but on the other hand, they might be affected less by growing up in such family structure, what then is going to be the overall impact of changes in family structure to changes in socioeconomic inequality of opportunity over time? So this is not so clear once we take into account this heterogeneity. So this is actually what I will try to do in the analysis that I'm going to present to you today. So first of all, I would like to quantify how much family structure changes over time contributed to inequality of opportunity, and I pay special attention to differences between boys and girls. We can talk a little bit more about that later. Alright, so data. I'll be using two cohorts, the NLSY cohorts that I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with, and we look at outcomes. So these are cohorts where they follow children from adolescence to their adulthood, and I'm using the waves of the early 30s, which is the most recent one available for the 97 cohort, and I will look mostly at years of education. I also did analysis on cognitive test scores, but I'm not going to talk much about that here. I have additional analysis with me if you're very interested in this. So I'm focusing on years of education. why years of education and why not high school completion or bachelor degree completion? Exactly the comment that was just made, that we might be favoring a certain outcome if we focus on the bottom of the educational distribution or on the top of the educational distribution. So that's why I use years of education to be kind of as neutral as possible. I do robustness checks on bachelor degree completion and high school completion, and I will present them at the end. So this is the main dependent variable of interest. The key independent variables are family structure, and I measure family structure at age 16, 17, and I arrived at some pretty rough categories with whom the children were living at that time. So they were either living with both biological parents, living with a parent and a step-parent, living with a single parent, or not living with a parent at all. Yes?
I'm wondering if you're considering the effect of change as opposed to current status.
This was my original ambition, was to include childhood family structure trajectories. But for one of the cohorts it was quite complicated, because if I remember correctly, they only had information, for instance, on marriage and not on repartnering. And so it was, I didn't manage to come to comparable childhood family structure trajectories. Of course, this is a very interesting question. Nonetheless, a lot of the research on family structure actually makes a big, empirically has found a big division between kind of the most advantaged trajectories, so to say, of living always with your two parents, and all the other trajectories. Of course, some of them are more disadvantageous than others, but I would say that roughly that division is there. Yeah? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, you tell me yes.
We can talk more about it. Yeah. But I agree, this was my original ambition, but I didn't manage to fulfill that ambition. The second main variable of interest is education. So I use mother's education instead of father's education or another measure, because there's a lot of missing information on father's education, especially among single parent families, obviously. So I do robustness checks with father's education, but I really trust the ones on mother's education more. Another possibility would have been to use family income, but there are also some issues there because, it's not measured for everybody in the first wave. Also, worth mentioning is that in the main analysis, I use a relative measure of mother's education. So I kind of, for both cohorts, divide the distribution into quintiles. And this is because, of course, for the older cohort, having a mother with college education is probably something very different than having a mother with college education in more recent cohorts. Because, of course, in the past it might have been a very advantaged group, and in the more recent past it might have been a bit of a still advantage, but not as much as before. So that's why I decided to focus on this relative measure of education, and I mainly focus on comparing the lowest quintile with the highest quintile. So this will be, I do report it for the group in the middle, but this is kind of where I focus on. This is the distribution what I ended up with when I used the quintiles. In all the analysis, I control for ethnicity, region, and age. All right. The main procedure, the main method I'm using is the Kitagawa decomposition procedure, also more famously known as the Blinder-Owachaka decomposition. And it's an adaptation to, because normally this is used for cross-sections, and I'm using an adaptation of Kim that allows studying changing gaps between groups over time. So basically what, and this is a decomposition analysis, so basically it's a bit of an accounting thing what I'm doing here. And I'm basically interested in the absolute change in the SES gap in years of education across both cohorts. So it's years of education of the highest, of individuals with higher educated mothers minus years of education of individuals with lower educated mothers, so the absolute gap, and it's a change in that absolute gap across cohorts. Yes?
And so, I mean, motivated very effectively the rising class gap in family structure and the notion of causal and not so causal effects of family structure on outcomes. And we know that there is an association between origins and destinations, but there's some debate, I thought, about whether that association is changing over time, right? So when people have tried to look at changes in social mobility over time, in terms of relative mobility, I thought the story was actually less than you think in the US. So is there something to decompose here in terms of the change?
Yeah, let me skip this. I will go back to this. So this is actually what we're...
You can tell me to wait.
Whoa, okay. I was going to show everything. Yeah, no, this is very right, because first we started with some absolute measures, and if we use absolute mother's education, we get a clear widening of the gap. When we started using relative mother's education, many of the gaps, for instance, in cognitive ability, disappeared. That's why the results for cognitive ability are also not that interesting. For years of education, though, so this is for both cohorts the gradient, so to say, in years of education. This is the 79 cohort for boys, and this is the 97 cohort, and we see a slight increase in the gap of like a half a year. For girls, it's bigger, the breach between the groups. So for years of education, we still see this, but it's definitely right that for other outcomes that we have considered, it kind of disappeared once we took this relative notion. Okay, so we have this absolute gap and the change in this absolute gap over time, and we would like to decompose this into 5 parts. The first part is this kind of isolates the Diverging Destiny story in its most, operationalizes the Diverging Destiny story in its most simple form. So this is the contribution of changes in the socio-economic stratification of family structures over time, assuming a homogeneous effect across cohorts and across socio-economic groups. So this is kind of the Diverging Destiny story in its simplest form. So this is why I like this decomposition, because it filters out exactly this story. The second part is, of course, that effect sizes also change over time. So they do not only differ across groups, they also change over time. So it could be that across time, families have gotten better at dealing with family structure changes, or that certain family structures are not that disadvantaged anymore, or the other way around, that they have started being more associated to outcomes across time. And given that disadvantaged children are more likely to grow up in an alternative family structure, if the effects related to growing up in such a family are increasing over time, this component is also likely to increase the SES gap in education. So this is the second term of this decomposition. Yes?
What are these sums taken over?
Excuse me?
What are you summing over?
Blub, 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 blub.
Just the...
Yeah, the sums. Yeah, they're the different groups. Boop, 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 boop. Sorry, I'm a bit confused now.
Yeah. Or not, we don't have to get bogged down in this.
Yeah, I think maybe the sums are not correct here.
Okay,
but
I can ask you.
Okay,
Sorry,
okay.
I didn't mean to, yeah.
Alright, so there's a third component which actually quantifies that the changes over time in the effects might not be equal for everybody. So it might be that certain socioeconomic groups have become very good at dealing with family structure changes, whereas others have not. And of course this has consequences for the socioeconomic gap in outcomes too. There's a fourth component, I'm not going to talk much about that now, and there is an unexplained part. Alright, so we have these 5 components of kind of, first of all, descriptively composing this difference. And I'll talk a little bit about causality, of course, at some, maybe I'll see how it goes. Yes?
Going back to that
Yeah.
analysis design there, I suppose changes in the selectivity, adverse selection into the lowest education group here are going to show up as changes in the size of the effects.
Of course, partially they are, because I'm averaging the effect sizes across cohorts and across groups. So it is true that this is an average of the changes over time. That is true. So we kind of assume that that is the base.
But that's a small effect or something.
Exactly.
Because otherwise, what you're getting isn't really what you're looking for.
True. No, yeah. So part of this, of course, goes into that, but there's not really. There are also different ways of doing this decomposition where you do not average across cohorts and groups, but then you have to choose one cohort as kind of the reference, and then your results are going to depend on these choices. I did do that in robustness checks, and it doesn't really change the story that much, but it does, for this reason, I chose to average across the cohorts. Okay, so going, yes?
About 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, I'll be quick. Thanks. Okay, so this is the development of the socioeconomic gap. Can this be explained by, first of all, here we see the changing socioeconomic stratification of family structure, and we see that even though most children were still living with both their parents in the first cohort, we see that this declined a lot. The lighter bars are the recent cohort, and we see that this declined a lot, and especially for those with lower educated mothers. And what has increased a lot are the other family structures. The second one is, this is purely an association, the association of these different family structures with years of education. And we see that there is a statistically significant association for all of these family structure types with years of education, both for boys and girls. So, what is the contribution of these factors if we assume a homogeneous effect across cohorts and groups? This is the SES gap in 79 in the first cohort, and now I'm going to add the part that is due to these changes in SES stratification. We see relatively little, 4 or 5%. So this is not dramatic at all in my opinion, but nonetheless, it might be something. But if we take also into account, for instance, causality, probably this is an upper bound estimate of the influence of this component. If we assume that in general selection into alternative family structures is kind of negative based on resources and so forth, based on all this research that has shown that if we control for endogeneity, the effects of family structure go down, this is probably a bit of an overestimation of this component. Yes?
So the dark part of the bar is what the gap is in 79, and then the light part of the increment from family structure stratification changes.
Yeah.
Well, if we had another cap on the bar that was the total change in 97, how much more would that be? A lot more? Or is it like that explains a lot of the change, it just wasn't very much change?
No, we'll get there. It's for.
Okay,
I'm going to add it gradually.
You're going to add on. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. That'll be great.
Okay. So the second one is changing effect
I just have
sizes.
a simpler question. I don't understand the 3.3 before you add the line is what? It's the
absolute gap.
it's 3 years between the highest the mother in the highest category and the lowest category
Exactly.
in
79.
79. And how does the earlier and 97 says?
So, for instance, let me say, like the 97 bar reaches like until here,
Okay.
and I'm decomposing that total change in the gap into different components. Yeah, it would have been good to show that. To show, yeah. So for boys, I think it's around here. For girls, also it's like this. Okay, so that's what we're trying to explain. Sorry. Okay, so here I'm showing changing effect sizes across time. And we actually see, so this is basically an interaction of the cohort with, I grouped here for simplicity all the alternative family structures together, otherwise I could not present this in time. And we see actually that effects or the associations got bigger all the time. So this, of course, also contributed to some extent to increases in the socioeconomic gap. We can talk about talking about causality is a bit harder here. I'm not as confident as the one before, whether this is an overestimation or underestimation. If we consider that selection is ever more negative based on socioeconomic characteristics, this might be an overestimation, but there's really not enough research to kind of claim it. Then we go to heterogeneity. So do these associations differ according to socioeconomic background? For boys in 79 we see that it doesn't really, but in 97 we see that this heterogeneity becomes statistically significant and larger. So the effects, or at least the associations of family structure became stronger, especially for socioeconomically advantaged boys. What happens if we add this here? It doesn't end up on the top, it comes in the bottom. And it actually cancels out the whole story that we've seen. What happens for girls? For girls, we actually see that already in 1979, the advantaged girls, the associations were larger for them, the negative association. But we see in 79 that it turned around. All right, I'm sorry, this is very confusing. It's very confusing for me. So we don't have a nice uniform story. For girls, we have the complete opposite. And if I pull these models and do more interactions, this is only marginally significant here, but the change over time is very, very significant. So for girls, it goes in the opposite direction. And this is around 9% of the original gap, and this is like 12% of the original gap. We'll get to explanations a little bit more. I just want to show you here the final result that I should have shown at the beginning. So this is the overall change in the SES gap between cohorts for girls, and it's 75% could be accounted for by family structure changes and its effects. For boys, not at all, nothing. So this is kind of has to be added up here, and we actually see that the contribution is negative. So what about causality? We already talked a little bit about this component, that it's probably an overestimation, and how this component, we don't have enough to be very sure about that. But what about the heterogeneity, which seems to be the key part of this story? Well, gender differences are very hard to explain based on explanations of endogeneity. If we argue that it's certain families that are likely to select into certain family structures or certain people, it's very hard to stroke that with an explanation why it matters so differently for boys than for girls. So I checked actually this statistically using, first of all, OLS, and we see this is a huge model with a three-way interaction, and we see that the differences are statistically significant. Then I tried to estimate sibling fixed effects models, but we see, as we talked with Sarah today, that our standard errors explode, and we don't really see significance here. So one interpretation could be that there's no effects. I would not defend that. But we see kind of that the coefficient of the interaction effect holds up. And actually the general coefficient of family structure, of course, in a sibling fixed effects model, there are a lot of ifs here, so I don't want to go into that too much. But I would at least kind of argue that it's very hard to explain this story based on endogeneity. Okay, we can have endless discussion about this probably. So I would like to move on. There are other things I did. I replicated this analysis for cognitive test scores, basically nothing going on. And we see the same for high school completion and for bachelor degree completion. We get the same results. I can show them if you want to. We see the same in different subsamples, even though...
The same results means that family structure is a big part of the change, and then there's different effects for boys and girls? What is
exactly.
That? Okay.
Exactly. So this is, for instance, bachelor degree completion. We see the same story. And it's the same, for, even though a bit less clear for the high school completion. This is high school completion. and for cognitive test scores, nothing is going on. Then there are the subsamples. We can talk about that if there's interest, but maybe I go to the conclusion and then we have time for all kinds of questions. So, conclusions. Increases in the socioeconomic stratification of family structures widened the SES gaps in education only slightly, 4 to 5%, and this is probably an upper bound estimate. But what appears to be much more important are effect sizes and variation in effect sizes. So, especially changes in heterogeneity appear to be running the show. So, two main discussion points. If we want to explain changes in inequality of opportunity, at least in this debate, we have very much concentrated on the incidence of certain events and the family structure, which is good, it's very important. But we have kind of ignored how people deal with events and situations. And it appears to be, at least from this analysis, maybe you don't believe the numbers, you do, at least I think a case can be made that we should focus on how people deal with situations. Because effect sizes appear so important once we quantify everything and how much the variables we're interested in contribute to these SES gaps. So this would imply, unfortunately, maybe, or fortunately now that we have them, that we need large sample sizes and causality are important, but also mechanisms. And I think, as a sociologist, I think there's a lot of space there in trying to understand how people deal with adverse events. I think there's a lot to be gained there. A second conclusion is that maybe you didn't believe everything I was saying about causality. It's very possible. But at least I think you have to agree that the empirical evidence for family structure being a main driver of inequality of opportunity is very thin. Well, for girls not, but sorry, this is very confusing. So, as a last point, I think, and talking about how people deal with events, what we actually see, these are basically the trends over time, only with some controls included. And we see that, in general, educational attainment, of course, has been going up, but it has not been going up for boys. But this is actually, we also see this a little bit in the low SES group. But the surprising one is that the gap between girls from alternative family structures and from intact family structures has been closing. And this is the only group where we see that. For all the other groups, we see a widening of the gap, like with the boys. We see it in both. In all groups, we see the widening of the gap, except for the advantaged girls. So I think, and in the spirit of this discussion point, what are these girls doing in order to, or how are they dealing with this in such a way that they're successful? I think this could be a very interesting question that could be relevant for many reasons. Okay, so let me finish with another citation. So at the end of the album, Jill Scott Heron reflects, and he actually makes a similar point. We should not look at family structure, but we should look at how people deal with living in such a situation. So he says, I came from what they call the broken home, but if they ever really called at our house, they would have known how wrong they were. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Great, so we actually have plenty of time for questions.
I didn't really understand why you were saying that. So you showed that graph where it's very different for, it's negative for boys and positive for girls, and you say that's the evidence that there is no heterogeneity effect. And first, I don't really understand that. And then my second question was, do you have information about mothers' economic activity? And when you put that in, do you see any difference? Because there could be some impact, not only on economic resources, but also you're starting your talk with the role model note from that singer. And role model, maternal role model might have a very different impact on boys and girls, and so that could also feed into the hetero or endogeneity.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Of course, thank you. Of course, there are a lot of open questions in trying to understand why I'm getting these results. And I think the first step, especially since this argument was so prominent, was to show that this is something we should probably look at. In terms of mother's economic activity, the problem is that this survey starts only at the end of adolescence, or from age 12, 13. So I don't know what all happened in the past. Maybe there are employment histories available, so it would be somehow possible. But I would see this rather like as a mechanism of how we, and the same with role models, and I would love to dive into that, why we are getting these results here. Of course, with these differences between boys and girls, a lot of people might think about this as maybe how boys and girls react differently to living in a family structure, how they deal with living only with their mother. But there's not much I can say about that, at least right now. Maybe I hope to get there in the next steps. Regarding your point about here that I'm arguing that I find it very hard to explain this based on endogeneity. So that's, you had a hard time following this argument, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is, given that boys and girls normally grow up in the same families, it's very, normally arguments based on endogeneity say it's certain people that select into alternative family structures, and they are disadvantaged. This is the argument about selection normally. This argument should, however, work similar for boys and girls, unless the gender of the child somehow has to do with who ends up separating and not. But that's why I ran these sibling fixed effects models where I compare siblings. So it's very hard to explain differences between siblings based on explanations that are common to the whole family. Yes, please.
So, thanks for your talk. I see now the norm is 2 questions, so I will ask my second question very quickly. So, you're picking up with people when they're like 15, 16, and I would imagine that a lot of these effects will be actually much younger, because there's a whole literature about how as kids age, the peers become much more important than the parents. That's an argument people make. So I'm wondering if you have any prospects of doing that. And my other, actually was a more fundamental question, I think, and that's that the measure of the idea of family structure is, so I'm thinking about this high SES, low SES situation, and I think it's a plausible claim that the high SES family that dissolved, when the parents separated, that the family with the child that's left over is possibly much lower resourced in terms of family connections than the low SES family that separates. If we think that low SES families would be more likely to, for example, live near family, they're less geographically mobile. Now these are all maybe just received facts that are wrong. But when I visualize it that way, then the low SES family is actually not as broken. I guess I'm saying Bill Scott Hearn's point, as the equivalent family in the high SES. And I wonder, is that part of the story? I think you could get that with 66. Nothing wrong with qualitative analysis, but I'll probably do something with statistics.
Thanks. Yeah. I very much actually like both of your points. So first of all, following the kids over time. So I think, given that there's not much going on in terms of cognitive ability, I think, and this is something I'm always seeing, is that I think family structure matters much more for things that are more malleable, that are easy to change, especially choices. I mean, choices you can change from today to tomorrow. Cognitive ability you cannot. So I would be very interested to look at that, especially choices of enrolling in higher education, completing high school. I would love to do at some point, there are some plans to do transition models to look at primary, secondary effects, but that hasn't started yet, so I hope to get there. And in terms of the connectedness of families, I think this is very interesting, and actually originally I wanted to look not only at SES differences but also at ethnic differences. but it was, I already have so much to tell that I thought it was, that's way too much. So actually, I think we see the same thing with children, African American children being affected less by family structure. Too, we see that result too, and this is often explained by social networks. I would love to look at that, even qualitatively. I don't have any. I love qualitative research. So.
That's fine.
Okay.
You go for it.
Yeah.
So I think the way you concluded was saying, we shouldn't think about boys so much as the sort of anomalous group is, what was it, high SES girls, but I sort of started thinking about boys already, so maybe this is not right. But it seems like another thing that changed across these cohorts, particularly for low SES boys who become young men, is mass incarceration in the United States.
Yeah.
So is there something, is part of why there's this large residual or something, I mean, that's a gender differentiated exposure that could have really important consequences for attainment. I haven't really thought this through.
Yeah, I haven't looked at incarceration. It would be, I did look at arrests. I didn't find very much. Also, given that incarceration is so unequal between ethnic groups, I also, I think we see the same for different ethnic groups. So this would probably, if this was the case, would probably play out stronger for African Americans, which we see is a little bit the extent, but the story seems to be quite similar. Well, actually, now that you say it, there's quite a lot. So yeah, there could be a story there. Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, thanks. I'll check if I can. I don't know if the analyst why.
You can do it with, I think, where they are residing at the wave.
Ah, okay, great. Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's okay. Yes, please.
So, the question mark, diverging destinies, I'm just trying to figure out what your answer is. And it seemed like in the very first slide where you showed as bars, you had a little bar on top of a big bar, so it seemed small. But then I asked my question, it seemed like that little bar is as a fraction of all of the little bars is what we should be, that's the answer to your question? Okay, so is it small or large? I think it was like a quarter, is that right?
For girls, it's definitely large.
I want to look at the bar that only has the due to general changes in family structures.
That was the
Sorry,
first step.
First one.
Yeah,
This one.
yeah, okay, and now, anyway, that's like a quarter of the total change, is that right?
No, it's much less. This is for of the change. It's something like like 15% or something.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
that's
the way to interpret this is that the diverging outcomes of children, 15% of it might be attributed to changes in family structure, and 85% of it is other stuff? Is that what you're saying?
no. My argument is because I see your point. If we would only look at this, there is a contribution that we cannot that should not be ignored. However, it's all these other. My argument is kind of saying like, if we do this, we assume these homogeneous effects, and I'm kind of saying that this might be a mistake. And once we not only look at the incidents, but also how people deal with them, which should be part of such a quantification, this actually gets cancelled out for boys, but it becomes stronger for girls. So there is no uniform answer here to Diverging Destinies question mark. For boys, no, but for girls, yes. So it's not so much about this single point. This is more to illustrate how the basic argument holds up, and it does.
So if I think about this, if I rephrase it and ask, if we equalized family structures between these two extreme groups, it would not change what happened to boys? That's your argument? Therefore,
Exactly.
But it would,
For girls.
it would change what happened to girls.
Exactly. So we actually have some additional analysis on, because you could argue, are we capturing the real change in the gradient here, right? So we could say, the time period you're looking at, there is already a gradient here. So maybe we're not capturing the full extent. So we also did additional analysis where we actually did these kind of simulations, what if everybody would grow up in two-parent families? And actually there we see the same story. So for boys, the SES gap would be smaller. For girls, it would be larger. No, the other way around. Sorry. Yeah. But that is exactly the argument. Yeah.
Just another ignorant question, but I don't understand how you can have varying effects and be accounting for the change in the composition. It just seems strange to me. It seems like that would... How is the question of how does change in composition meaningful unless we're holding the compositional effects constant? Just not...
Doesn't add up for you.
No. I mean, the question is usually phrased in terms of if there is a constant effect of something, then how much does the change influence it? But if there's a changing effect of it, then I just understand, I'm having trouble understanding what that even means, the compositional analysis where you're allowing effects to change. But maybe this is for our further discussion.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about this for at lunch. There was a question? Yeah.
I wasn't sure from what you said whether you're familiar with this literature, but there is a literature on the effect of boy kids, even boy pregnancies, girl pregnancies, on marital outcomes. Premaritally conceived kids lead to marriages at different proportions for males and females, and higher divorce, I think, for girls and for boys and so on. My recollection of that literature is that these effects are all pretty small. I can't really imagine them having much impact on what you're doing, but it is there.
I agree. My how to say it, friends were from the causality police. They were really like making similar points. Yeah, but what about selection into this family structure based on gender, of course? But these effects are really minuscule. But that should still not be enough. So that's why I ran these sibling fixed effects models where I focus on boys and girls coming from the same families. Unfortunately, the standard errors explode, but we get the same substantive results. So yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much.